Farmer Tom Finnegan had passed the Deep Sigh swamp dozens of times over many years and had grown accustomed to seeing all sorts of things there. But what he stumbled upon that morning made him call the local police number immediately. He could not clearly explain exactly what he was seeing. He only repeated that someone very small was lying in the water, and it was definitely not a doll. The police arrived quickly and immediately sealed off access to the swamp. In the murky water, there was indeed a small figure. There were no signs of a struggle anywhere around. Only a single distinct imprint of a small boot nearby and a piece of cloth on the wet ground. These details became the first pieces of evidence sent for examination. For several hours, the police tried to figure out exactly who had been found, but no one in the village had reported anyone missing. It was only the next day that a married couple, Sarah and Jonathan O'Connor, came to the station. They reported that their younger daughter Emily had not returned home the previous evening during a walk with her older sister Fiona. The couple could not explain the reason for their silence. The investigation confirmed. It was Emily O'Connor, the family's younger daughter, who had moved to Ballymore only 3 months prior. Now the investigation focused entirely on her relatives, especially on Fiona, the last person to have seen Emily alive. Until that day, the O'Connor family seemed perfectly ordinary. Sarah and Jonathan had arrived in Ballymore in early May 2018 and settled in a small stone house on the outskirts of the village. Neighbors said that the new residents were immediately warmly received, although they kept somewhat to themselves. But in the countryside, this is common. Newcomers always look around first before putting down roots and making friends. Jonathan was a real estate agent. Before moving to Ballymore, he had worked in a large city in Eastern Ireland, but according to acquaintances, the family always wanted a quieter life, without the urban hustle. Sarah liked this quiet place. Picturesque hills, clean air, and that very swamp where locals sometimes dug for peat. They quickly bought the house, an old cottage only 1 mile from the village centre. The place seemed ideal for a family that had decided to start fresh. The couple had 2 children, the older Fiona, who had recently turned 12, and the younger Emily, 5 years her junior. According to teachers and neighbours, Emily easily got along with people and quickly made friends among the village children. She was often seen playing with others in the yard of the house or near the village shop. Fiona was the exact opposite of her sister. Quiet, reserved, and always a little distant. She often walked alone, barely spoke to neighbors, and if invited to play or chat, she usually refused. But at school, this was taken calmly. Teachers said that many teenagers go through a similar phase at that age. The parents also believed it was only temporary, a normal teenage reserve that would soon pass on its own. Outwardly, everything seemed fine. Jonathan continued to work from home. Sarah was setting up the new house and looking after the daughters, and the neighbors gradually got used to the quiet rhythm of the O'Connor family's life. Until the evening of August 15th, no one noticed anything unusual. On that day, Sarah had seen her daughters go for a walk. It was already around 6 o'clock in the evening. The summer day was drawing to a close. The girls often walked in the fields and hills near the house, sometimes even to the swamp, but always returned before dark. That evening, only Fiona came back. Sarah immediately asked her where her sister was, but the girl replied that Emily had been delayed and promised to return a little later. The mother decided to wait and did not immediately raise the alarm. When it became completely dark, Sarah and Jonathan went looking, but soon returned home without having found anything suspicious. They thought Emily might have gone to one of her new friends' houses and would return in the morning. This might sound strange, but in a small village where everyone knows everyone, such things were not uncommon. The O'Connors had not yet accustomed themselves to local customs and decided not to panic prematurely. But in the morning, when the girl did not return, they understood that they could no longer wait. Only then did Sarah and Jonathan go to the police. Until that moment, their lives seemed absolutely normal and attracted no attention whatsoever. None of the neighbors could imagine that something so terrible could have happened in an ordinary family that had only recently moved to a quiet village. Now, the police had to carefully investigate the events of that evening. When Fiona came home alone, Sarah initially considered it a simple children's quarrel. The two sisters often went for evening walks, sometimes argued, and then reconciled. But this time, something worried the mother. Fiona was silent, avoided her gaze, and tried to quickly go upstairs to her room. Sarah stopped her, asked where Emily was, and the older sister replied calmly, almost without emotion. "She ran off. I didn't find her." The sentence sounded too short, too even, as if Fiona had said it more than once. Sarah tried to ask more specifically, but her daughter kept repeating the same thing. "She just ran ahead. I couldn't find her." Then she silently went upstairs without giving any further explanations. The father, Jonathan, only came home after dark. When he learned that the younger one had not yet returned, he went searching himself. He walked the nearby paths, called her name several times, but there was no answer. When he returned home, he suspected that Emily might have stayed overnight with a friend from a neighboring house. The couple decided to wait until morning to avoid causing premature panic in the village. For small villages like Ballymore, situations where children stayed with friends without warning were not uncommon. But in the morning, it became clear that this was a completely different case. None of the neighbors had seen or heard Emily since the evening. And only then did Sarah and Jonathan understand that the situation was far more serious than a common children's prank. During the questioning at the police station, Fiona behaved just as calmly and evenly as at home. The investigators recorded her initial statements. "We went for a walk. She ran ahead. I called her, but she didn't answer. I waited. Then I went home." When asked why she hadn't immediately told her parents everything and asked for help, Fiona replied briefly, "I didn't think it was important." This puzzled the police officers. It seemed strange that a 12-year-old girl did not understand the seriousness of the situation. However, one of the teachers confirmed that Fiona had always been reserved and often reacted to events rather coolly and distantly. But in a situation concerning her own sister, this looked completely different. Later, the parents recalled another detail that did not seem important on the first evening. Fiona's clothes were stained with mud. When the mother asked what had happened, Fiona calmly said that it was slippery in the swamp. She had slipped and fallen. Sarah did not ask further, as this sounded quite logical. The swampy area was indeed difficult to pass. When the police began to check the chronology of the day, it turned out that 45 minutes had passed between the girl's departure and Fiona's return. Fiona could not describe this time in detail in any way and limited herself to the same sentence. "She ran ahead. I waited. Then I went home." 45 minutes, which could have been crucial, were missing from her account. And that raised many questions. Neighbors and volunteers immediately began searching the nearby fields and paths. They examined the swamp, where there were very dangerous sections with deep pits and boggy ground in places. Many feared that a small person could accidentally slip, but no traces were found. Nevertheless, no one yet assumed that something serious could be behind it. Fiona remained distant, almost impassive, throughout. When people came to the O'Connor's house to help with the search, she sat silently on the steps, looking at the ground. No tears, no worry. Even when police officers tried to talk to her, she answered calmly as if it were something completely commonplace. Very soon it became clear that the only witness to what truly happened on the evening of August 15th was Fiona. And now her words became the central part of the investigation. When the results of the initial examination were available, the conclusion seemed obvious: an accident. The local peat bogs were notorious for their treacherous ground, where even an adult could easily slip. But one of the forensic technicians noticed a detail that could not be ignored. In his report, there was a note about an unusual mark that did not fit the typical picture of such incidents. A clear and clean mark was discovered on Emily's neck. It looked too perfect, too artificial, as if someone had deliberately pressed an object with a thin metal edge against the skin. It resembled neither a casual bruise from a fall nor an ordinary scratch. The imprint had clear, straight edges and a perfectly geometric shape, which immediately ruled out its accidental origin. The expert's report detailed that the shape of the mark resembled an oval ornament with intertwined lines that closed into a single figure. The forensic technicians took several detailed photographs, carefully recorded the measurements, and took samples of microparticles from the skin surface. Laboratory analysis revealed that the mark contained microscopic silver particles and fragments of soil, typical of the exact peat bog where the discovery was made. The investigators' first guess was that the mark could have come from a piece of jewelry Emily was wearing. But the parents immediately rejected this version. Emily had never worn anything of the sort. The only piece of jewelry in the family that resembled this imprint in shape was an old silver locket belonging to the older daughter, Fiona. The locket was a family heirloom that the O'Connors had received from their paternal grandmother. It was a piece of jewelry with an intricate Celtic pattern, unique and easily recognizable. Jonathan confirmed that he had given the locket to Fiona right after they moved to Ballymore. Neighbors and school teachers also recalled that Fiona almost never parted with this piece of jewelry. She wore it constantly, whether she was at school, at home, or out and about. The investigators asked the family to provide the locket for comparison with the found imprint. Sarah immediately found it in Fiona's room, and the piece was sent for examination. A few hours later, the forensic technicians submitted their report. The ornament of the locket completely matched the shape of the mark discovered on Emily's neck. The measurements and lines matched to a fraction of a millimeter, ruling out any coincidence. Upon receiving this data, the investigators conducted an additional examination of the locket and found that on the inside of the piece of jewelry, in the fine engraving, particles of the same soil from the peat bog remained. This proved that the object had not only touched Emily's skin, but had come into direct contact with the scene of the incident. Furthermore, small traces of fresh mud, consistent with the boggy soil taken for analysis at the scene of the tragedy, remained on the chain and the pendant itself. This fact became the first serious piece of evidence in a case that initially appeared to be a trivial accident. Now the police were forced to seriously consider the possibility that what happened was not a simple fall or coincidence. They had to understand how Fiona's locket could have left such a clear mark on her younger sister's skin. Until this moment, the O'Connor family was perceived as victims of circumstances and a tragedy. But now, the attitude began to change. The question of exactly how the older sister's jewelry was pressed so firmly against the younger one's skin became the central point of the further investigation. This was the first concrete piece of evidence after which the police began to investigate not the external circumstances, but those who were with Emily in her last minutes. And now, Fiona was at the center of attention, the only person whose actions that evening remained unclear. When the forensic technicians submitted the report on the locket, the investigators invited the parents to the station. On the table, they laid out photos of the imprint, with the pendant itself next to them. Sarah O'Connor looked at the pictures and her face immediately went pale. The protocol simply states, "This is a family heirloom. It was worn by Fiona." After these words, there was silence in the room. For the investigators, this was the first direct link between a piece of evidence and a living person. Previously, everything looked like a tragic coincidence, but now a specific person was at the center of attention, the family's older daughter. From that moment on, the case was no longer about swamps, weather, and unfortunate coincidences. Fiona was invited to the station. According to the protocol, she was accompanied by her mother. The interrogation proceeded calmly. No tears, no attempts at justification. She sat in the chair, staring at a point, and answered briefly. When the investigator showed her the locket, Fiona calmly confirmed that it was her piece of jewelry. When asked where it was on the day of the walk, she replied, "On me." No hesitation, no fear in her voice. Only fatigue and indifference that seemed unnatural for her age. The investigator noted in his report that the child showed no emotional reaction to the mention of her sister. It seemed as if she did not fully understand the seriousness of what had happened, or simply did not want to talk about that day. When asked how the piece of jewelry could have ended up at the scene, Fiona calmly replied, "I don't know. Maybe it fell off." This sentence would later become crucial in analyzing her behavior. Experts in child psychology who were involved in the case would note that the intonation with which she spoke did not correspond to the reaction to the loss of a loved one. Her voice was even, her gaze fixed on one point, a complete absence of signs of distress. The police carefully examined the clothes Fiona had worn that evening. On the hem, they found traces of peat soil and small plant fragments, identical to those found at the scene of the tragedy. The mud was fresh and had a characteristic swampy smell. This confirmed that she was indeed in the swamp area when Emily disappeared. Several neighborhood witnesses reported seeing the sisters walking towards Deep Sigh. No one noticed anyone following them. There were no strange cars, no noises, no traces of third parties. Everything indicated that Fiona and Emily were alone there that evening. After comparing all statements and examination results, Fiona officially received the status of a person of special interest to the investigation. This did not mean charges, but it effectively made her the main object of observation. The investigator noted in his report, "The subject's behavior remains abnormally calm. An emotional reaction to questions about her sister is absent. When the locket is mentioned, her gaze lowers, her voice softens. Possible suppression of feelings or a deliberate avoidance of the topic is observed." From that moment on, an unbearable silence settled in the O'Connors' house. Sarah tried not to be alone with her daughter, and Jonathan spent more and more time out of the house, explaining it as the need to sort out papers. Fiona barely spoke, showed no interest in what was happening around her. She sat by the window and stared for hours in the direction of the swamps, as if waiting for someone to appear from there. Now the investigation definitively changed its direction. The police stopped looking at external circumstances and focused on what was happening within the family. All attention turned to Fiona, to her behavior, her silence, and what was hidden behind that calm. After Fiona received the status of a person of interest for the investigation, the investigators systematically began to review all the evidence collected at the crime scene. They were not interested in emotions, not in assumptions, but in pure science, that which can be measured, compared, and proven. Experts conducted a new analysis of Fiona's clothes, shoes, and personal belongings. The main subject of attention was her boots, exactly those in which, according to her words, she had gone for a walk with her sister on the day of the disappearance. In the laboratory, forensic technicians extracted microparticles of soil stuck in the tread of the sole. The composition of the soil matched the samples taken at the location where Emily was found, and the match was not just visual. Under the microscope, the characteristic combination of peat mass, moss, and mineral inclusions unique to the Deep Sigh swamp section was visible. Furthermore, chemical analysis revealed the presence of small particles of swamp water that had penetrated the fabric of the boot. According to expert estimates, the shoe had been in contact with the wet surface for at least several minutes, significantly longer than if a person had merely slipped on the edge. This meant that Fiona was where Emily was later found, and had spent enough time in that section for her boots to become soaked with water and mud from the lower soil layers. The next step was genetic examination. Hairs that did not belong to Emily were found on her clothes. One of them was partially caught in the fabric fiber as if it had been pressed there by pressure or friction. DNA analysis confirmed a complete match with the sample taken from Fiona. This match was absolute and ruled out any accidental error. When the results were submitted to the investigative department, it became clear that the dividing line between possibility and fact had disappeared. One could no longer say that the older sister was just somewhere nearby. Now it was proven that she was in direct contact with Emily shortly before she disappeared. The phrase appeared in the reports. Physical evidence confirms the presence of the suspect person in the crime scene area and interaction with the victim. The investigators did not jump to conclusions, but inwardly, they already understood. The picture was coming together into a single line. The police interrogated Fiona again. The results of the examination were read to her, and she was asked to explain how traces of the swamp could have gotten on her boots if, according to her words, she had only waited on the road. Fiona showed no change in expression, did not cry, was not confused. She answered in the same even tone, "I probably got too close by accident." Such an answer satisfied no one. The investigator noted that her behavior reflected neither surprise nor an attempt at defense, nor a desire for justification. It seemed as if Fiona was consciously distancing herself from what had happened, as if she were observing everything from the outside. For the police, everything now seemed unambiguous. Geology, genetics, and the logic of time fully indicated Fiona's presence at the scene of the tragedy. This evidence could not be a coincidence. Every analysis, every sample confirmed that something happened between the sisters that evening, which none of the adults had noticed at the time. From that moment on, the investigators no longer doubted the direction of their work. All efforts focused on reconstructing the last 45 minutes that separated the walk from Emily's disappearance. And at the center of this short but crucial period was Fiona O'Connor. While the investigators were checking facts and analyzing evidence, teachers and neighbors began to talk more frequently about how Fiona had behaved in the days following the tragedy. Her behavior seemed not just strange, it clearly did not match what everyone had expected. No tears, no confusion or fear, only aloofness and absolute indifference to conversations about her sister. The school psychologist provided the police with a detailed report. It noted that Fiona returned to school just a few days after the incident, refusing the offered leave. Her teachers described her state as emotionally detached, as if she was observing what had happened from the outside. In his notes, the psychologist emphasized that Fiona showed no emotions when discussing Emily. If asked questions, the girl would fall silent or answer monosyllabically, avoiding any mention of her sister's name. One of the teachers recalled offering her support and the opportunity to talk at any time. Fiona calmly told him that she saw no point in it. No aggression, no grief, just even indifference. This was so unusual that the educator even noted in the class register, "The student's behavior is atypical. Psychological problems are possible." Police reports also included excerpts from conversations with neighbors of the O'Connor family. They noted that after the tragedy, Fiona became even more withdrawn than before. She avoided contact, did not respond to greetings, and only left the house when absolutely necessary. One of the neighbors who came to the O'Connor's house to support the family noticed that the girl did not react at all to condolences. She just sat at the table and looked out the window as if she heard nothing around her. There was another fact that was included in the police reports. When the investigators conducted an additional search of the house, they found several of her drawings in Fiona's room. The pictures had no obvious meaning but were quite disturbing. Figures of people without faces, abstract lines and symbols, a recurring motif of a swamp landscape. The psychologist who examined these drawings pointed out that such creative works often reflect inner suppression and emotional tension. The psychologist's expert opinion on Fiona's personality appeared in the reports, mentioning signs of emotional alienation and social isolation. He noted that this did not prove her involvement in the tragedy, but clearly indicated profound psychological difficulties. The family did not comment on this assessment, although it was obvious that the parents were very worried about their older daughter's behavior. Sarah repeatedly tried to talk to her, asking what she felt, but each time Fiona answered briefly, "Everything is fine." Finally, Sarah gave up her attempts. The silence that reigned in the house became unbearable for her. Fiona's behavior did not prove her guilt, but the investigators received important confirmation. The psychological peculiarities of the older sister could have been a key factor in what happened. Emotional detachment, lack of reaction to serious events, and refusal to discuss details. All of this not only worried the police but strengthened their conviction that Fiona was hiding something important. Now, all that remained for the investigators was to find out whether her coldness was the result of the shock she experienced, or if there was something else behind it. Something that was still beyond the understanding of those around her. When the police decided to speak with Fiona again, the investigator was prepared to hear anything. Accusations, confessions, convoluted explanations. But what the girl said surprised even him. To the direct question of how the locket could have left such a distinct mark on Emily's skin, Fiona calmly replied that she had lost the piece of jewelry a week earlier. At first, no one took her words seriously. It seemed like just an attempt to deflect suspicion. But the girl insisted that the locket had disappeared long before the day she and Emily went for a walk. According to her, she had been walking alone near the swamp. The piece of jewelry had slipped from her neck, and she had not found it. Several days had passed since the loss, and Fiona claimed to have even told her mother about it. The police immediately summoned Sarah O'Connor to clarify this detail. Sarah confirmed that her daughter had indeed told her about losing the locket, but she hadn't given it much thought, thinking it was somewhere in the house. This information changed the mood in the department. Now the police had to determine whether this was true or not. The investigators decided to conduct another thorough search of the O'Connors' house. The police searched Fiona's room, the living room, the attic, the cellars, and the area around the house. The search lasted several hours. All items were inspected. Shelves, drawers, and cupboards were checked. But no matter how hard they tried, the locket was nowhere to be found. The investigation was once again at a dead end. If Fiona was telling the truth, and the piece of jewelry had indeed been lost earlier, how could one explain the perfect mark on Emily's neck, which matched the shape of that very piece? Who and in what way could have used the locket if Fiona herself was no longer wearing it? To confirm the girl's words, the police spoke with neighbors and her school friends. But no one could remember Fiona looking for the jewelry or even mentioning its loss. School teachers confirmed that the girl had come to school without the locket in recent days, although she had worn it constantly before. But even this could not be conclusive confirmation that she had lost it exactly where and when she claimed. Additionally, the area around the Deep Sigh swamp was checked. Volunteers, forensic technicians, and dogs carefully searched every meter of ground. They searched under trees, in the grass, in the mud. But even there, the piece of jewelry was not found. The situation became increasingly convoluted. The investigator noted in his report that the locket, which was the central piece of evidence, was physically missing. The fact of its absence presented the investigators with two equally uncomfortable options. Either Fiona was deliberately lying about the timing of the loss of the jewelry to mislead the investigation, or someone else had found it in the swamp and taken it, using it on the day the tragedy occurred. The forensic experts specifically noted that the mark on Emily's neck was very fresh and distinct, which virtually ruled out the locket having lain in the mud or water for a long time before the incident. It seemed as if the piece of jewelry must have appeared there literally on the same evening the girls went for a walk. Thus, the contradiction became the central mystery of the investigation. On the one hand, Fiona's statements were clear, logical, and the locket was indeed not found anywhere. On the other hand, the expert reports told a completely different story. Someone was clearly not telling the truth, and it was precisely this contradiction that the investigators now focused on. After the locket could not be found, the investigation once again turned to the only clue that remained undeniable: the imprint itself. This time, it was decided to involve a forensic expert specializing in physical contact and pressure marks. His expert opinion was to finally confirm or refute the version of an accidental touch. The expert carefully examined all images and measurements. He described in detail the shape, contours, and depth of the imprint, noting that the clarity and uniformity of the pattern indicated direct and strong pressure. In his report, the specialist noted that marks of this shape and depth never occur with accidental contact with jewelry or clothing. To create such an imprint, the object had to be pressed firmly and held on the skin for at least several seconds. The document stated it concretely. According to the criminalist's estimates, the pressure force required for such an imprint corresponded to the conscious pressing of an adult human hand. He emphasized that a light touch or an accidental fall of the piece of jewelry could not have left such a deep and clear mark. The report specifically noted that the uniformity of the pressure over the entire area of the imprint indicated intentional contact, where the object was held immovably without slipping. Furthermore, the expert was able to specify the time when this mark could have occurred. Examination of the soft tissues and skin reactions to pressure showed that the imprint occurred exactly at the time of the tragedy. This meant that the locket was pressed against Emily's neck exactly when she fell into the water, and could under no circumstances have remained on her before or after the incident. This information became a real turning point for the investigation. Now, the version that the piece of jewelry could have accidentally fallen off and left a mark completely lost its significance. For the first time, the investigation received concrete evidence that what happened had the nature of an intentional physical impact. The police again invited Fiona along with her mother for a conversation. This time, the investigators read out the criminalist's report in full to observe the girl's reaction to the new details. But Fiona remained completely calm again. She listened carefully to everything and simply repeated that she did not know how such a thing could have happened. Sarah looked confused and did not understand what to make of what had happened. For her, the expert's words sounded almost like an accusation against her older daughter, and she barely hid her agitation. In the meantime, the investigators again questioned neighbors and acquaintances to find out if anyone else could have had access to the piece of jewelry. However, none of them could recall any instances where someone had shown interest in the family heirloom or even held it. The locket was always around Fiona's neck. It was not lent out, not shown to any strangers. The criminalist's report forced the investigators to completely rule out the version of an accident. Now it was clear that the locket was deliberately pressed against Emily's neck at the time of the tragedy, and someone was clearly holding it, exerting significant force. Coincidence disappeared from the list of versions, and the police's entire attention was now focused exclusively on the people who were near Emily that evening. The investigation had already reached an obvious conclusion when, unexpectedly, new information emerged that completely changed the picture. A financial audit of the O'Connor family conducted by the police uncovered something that was, at first glance, completely incomprehensible. Large money transfers to a local farmer named Patrick Murphy were discovered in Jonathan O'Connor's bank records. The amounts were quite substantial and absolutely did not correspond to usual household or operating expenses. When investigators wanted to speak with Murphy, it turned out that he had literally disappeared. Neighbors reported that he had hastily left his farm in the early morning of August 16th. The same day, the terrible discovery was made in the swamp. At the request of the police, Interpol confirmed the farmer had flown out of Ireland and was heading towards Eastern Europe, leaving no contact details. The fact of his hasty departure made the police suspicious and prompted them to investigate this lead more closely. Jonathan was summoned for questioning. Initially, the father seemed calm and confident, but at the mention of the money transfers, he became visibly nervous. He admitted that he had transferred money to Murphy, but claimed they were payments for land. According to him, He had long planned to secretly expand the boundaries of his property by adding a small part of the neighboring plot, and expected to settle this later without the attention of the authorities. The police found this story unconvincing. They could not understand why clandestine money transfers were necessary for such a deal, and why the farmer suddenly decided to flee the country after the incident. All of this seemed strange and extremely suspicious, given the circumstances. Rumors also arose in the village that Patrick Murphy had long been in financial difficulties, and some even claimed to have seen him nervous and worried lately. Forensic experts again turned to the evidence collected in the swamp, trying to find anything that might indicate the farmer's presence in the area of the incident, but no new traces were found. Nevertheless, the emerging version of an abduction with the involvement of a third person was now actively pursued by investigators. This hypothesis fit well with the father's strange behavior, the clandestine money transfers, and Patrick Murphy's sudden departure. Jonathan continued to insist on his version of events, but the police met his words with great distrust, especially after specialists checked Jonathan's calls and discovered several conversations with Murphy late in the evening before the tragedy. Investigators began to examine the farmer's connections and his recent actions. Perhaps he had used the O'Connor family tragedy to cover his tracks and escape. Or perhaps his disappearance was directly linked to what happened in the family. Each of these versions now had every right to exist, and investigators could not ignore any of them. Thus, in a case that seemed entirely focused on Fiona and her possible role in the tragedy, a completely new suspect suddenly emerged. Investigators had to re-examine every detail and every witness to find out exactly how the figure of the escaped farmer could fit into the events of that fateful evening. While the police dealt with the father's strange financial transactions and searched for the missing farmer, another part of the team continued to investigate the O'Connor family's private life. Investigators knew, to understand what had really happened, one had to understand the people who had lived in this house long before that evening. During a renewed search of Fiona's room, her personal diary was found behind an old piece of furniture. It looked as if someone had tried to hide it from prying eyes. The pages of the diary gave investigators a glimpse for the first time of what Fiona thought and felt long before the tragedy. The entries were written calmly, but each of them showed how deeply Fiona suffered from inner problems, especially in connection with Emily. She constantly compared herself to her younger sister and repeatedly wrote that she felt invisible to her parents. In an entry made before the move to Ballymore, the girl wrote, "When Mum smiles at Emily, it's as if I'm just not there. Sometimes I think she loves her more because she is the right and good one, and I always do something wrong." Such notes repeated regularly and became more emotional over time. Psychologists noted that the girl might have serious problems with self-esteem and deep envy of her sister, which could be perceived as particularly painful at her age. The investigators decided to speak with Sarah, the girl's mother, again to understand to what extent the parents were aware of their older daughter's inner worries. Sarah reluctantly admitted that she had noticed how Fiona sometimes became withdrawn and irritable after dealing with her sister. She recalled how Fiona once, at a family celebration when Emily received another gift, abruptly and almost demonstratively left the room, slamming the door. Later, she told her mother, "I will never be like Emily, and you all don't care." Sarah explained that at that moment she thought it was just a youthful exaggeration that would pass on its own. She had no idea how serious her older daughter's feelings were. She also confirmed that Fiona rarely spoke openly about her worries, preferring to remain silent and keep everything to herself. These memories of the mother were consistent with the conclusions of the school psychologist who had previously drawn attention to the girl's reticence and her tendency to suppress emotions. The police began to put the individual puzzle pieces together to get a broader picture of the relationships within the family. The diary entries did not directly state that Fiona was planning anything bad. They merely reflected her inner world, full of suppressed emotions and misunderstanding. It became clear to the investigators that the relationship between the sisters was not as simple and unclouded as it seemed from the outside. Every new fact, Every new entry added further details to the portrait of the girl, whom no one fully understood, and perhaps did not even try to understand. The investigators now only had to find out whether these inner problems could be the cause of something more serious. Now they had to examine the living conditions of the O'Connor family even more closely to understand how all these small, barely perceptible conflicts had influenced the events of that day. The investigators decided to conduct 2 interrogations simultaneously. In the first room was Jonathan O'Connor, the father of the family. In the second, his older daughter Fiona. Both seemed tense, although each in their own way tried to hide their agitation. On this day, the investigations had to finally clarify which lead was false and which was real. Jonathan nervously tugged at his shirt and visibly avoided the investigators' gaze. When it came to the money transfers and his relationship with the farmer Patrick Murphy, he immediately began to justify himself. The man admitted that he had indeed tried to secretly expand his property from the local authorities. The money, he said, was transferred for a small part of the land adjacent to the swamp, where he planned to build an additional building. Jonathan spoke haltingly, often pausing as if considering every word, but emphatically assured that he had no other motives for contact with the farmer. At the same time, in the next room, the investigator kept asking Fiona the same questions. Her answers, however, changed literally every few minutes. First, the girl claimed she had gone for a walk with Emily and simply lost sight of her. Then she suddenly said her sister had run away and she decided to go home alone. Then she returned to the original version, but added details she had not mentioned before. The investigator carefully noted every word, giving Fiona the opportunity to express herself fully. Police officers constantly moved between the 2 rooms, comparing statements. The more they talked to Jonathan, the clearer it became that the farmer was nothing more than a chance encounter. Jonathan described in detail how long and secretly he had negotiated with Murphy, fearing penalties and trouble with the local administration. In his narrative, there was nothing that connected these financial transactions with Emily's disappearance. Investigators already knew from Interpol that Farmer Murphy had fled precisely because of his accumulated debts and problems with the law, and that this departure had nothing to do with the events in the O'Connor family. At the same time, Fiona's interrogation became increasingly tense. The investigator noticed how the girl became nervous when reminded of the expertise and the trail of the medallion. After changing her statement again, Fiona now claimed she had not only lost the medallion, but Emily herself had asked to try it on and had not returned it. When asked why she had not said this earlier, the girl remained silent and looked away. Meanwhile, Jonathan had finally cleared up the matter with the farmer. The presented bank documents, purchase confirmations, and even the statement of the lawyer who had helped with the transaction fully confirmed his words. The police officially classified the lead to the farmer as false. Jonathan was allowed to leave, although his reputation was severely damaged. He left the police station with his head bowed, knowing that all suspicions would now fall back on his family. In the meantime, Fiona, feeling the increasing pressure, began to get even more entangled. The girl no longer answered clearly, her voice trembled and her words became incoherent. She stubbornly avoided eye contact and returned to the first version, trying to convince the investigator that she knew nothing and had seen nothing. At the end of the day, the investigation drew an important interim conclusion. Fiona's statements were officially classified as incredible due to numerous contradictions and changes in detail. This news was another heavy blow to the O'Connor family, who had already lost almost all the trust of those around them. Now the police focused exclusively on Fiona and completely ruled out the involvement of third parties. With every hour, the circle tightened and the girl found herself alone at the center of this dramatic story without support, surrounded on all sides by questions to which she had no clear answers. After a series of exhausting interrogations and endless checks, investigators decided to once again carefully examine the path the sisters normally took home from their walk. The police had already walked this path several times, but this time they deliberately walked slower and more attentively, inspecting every detail. It was there that one of the officers noticed a faint metallic gleam in a small drainage ditch, just a few steps from the path. He approached cautiously and discovered that in the mud, lightly covered with leaves and small debris, lay the medallion that the entire investigation team had been looking for so long. The discovery location immediately attracted the attention of the police. It was precisely on the way from the Deep Sigh swamp to the O'Connor house, which could only mean one thing. The object had not simply been lost, it had been deliberately discarded. Had it accidentally fallen during the walk, it would hardly have been so far from the actual scene. Forensic experts documented the location of the find and carefully secured it for further investigation. In the laboratory, the medallion underwent a thorough examination. Despite its long stay in mud and water, the piece of jewelry was quite well preserved, especially the clasp, on which experts could find clear fingerprints. When they compared these with the previously created database, it was absolutely clear. The prints belonged to Fiona. This discovery completely refuted all the girl's previous versions about the loss of the medallion long before the incident. Now it became obvious that the piece of jewelry was in her hands that evening and ended up in the ditch after what happened in the swamp. There was no longer any doubt about the reliability of the investigation results. This was not just a coincidence, but irrefutable confirmation that Fiona had deliberately disposed of the object after it had left a trace on her sister's neck. The investigators summoned Sarah and Jonathan again to personally inform them of this news. Sarah sat as if paralyzed, her gaze wandering as if she could not believe what she was hearing. Jonathan merely lowered his head in silence. The couple realized that they could no longer deny the obvious. Their older daughter had not only hidden the truth, but also deliberately tried to mislead everyone by disposing of the main piece of evidence. Parallel to this event, the investigators conducted another conversation with Fiona. When she was told that the medallion had been found, the girl became visibly nervous for the first time during all interrogations. She tried to say she couldn't remember how the medallion got there. Then she repeated the version that she had lost the jewelry, but already, very uncertainly, as she understood that she was no longer believed. The girl fell silent, looked away, and tried not to look the investigators in the eye. Now the police had what had been missing for so long: irrefutable physical evidence that directly linked Fiona to the events of that day. At this stage of the investigation, it was no longer necessary to check versions and look for explanations for her contradictory statements. The medallion found on the way home clearly confirmed her presence at the scene of the tragedy and the deliberate attempt to conceal her role in what happened. The investigation prepared for the next step, knowing that they now not only had to clarify the evidence, but also try to understand the motives for the act of a girl who was considered by everyone around her to be withdrawn, but completely normal. At the next interrogation, the investigator presented Fiona with the found medallion. The object was placed on the table directly in front of her. The girl immediately recognized the piece of jewelry and confirmed that it belonged to her. This time, she did not repeat the earlier versions that the medallion had been lost long before the incident. The investigator stated that experts had found her fingerprints on the clasp of the medallion, and this was in complete contradiction to her original statements. Instead of trying to justify herself or find an explanation, Fiona calmly and briefly confessed her guilt. She explained that during the walk near the swamp, a conflict had arisen between her and Emily, and confirmed that she herself had pushed her sister into the water. She added that Emily could not get out, but showed no recognizable emotions or signs of remorse. Her words were recorded by the investigator in the official protocol. Despite the gravity of the confession, Fiona's behavior remained unchanged. She remained composed and did not avoid the investigator's gaze. It was separately noted in the protocol that her emotional state at the time of the confession did not change, but remained stably calm and indifferent. After the interrogation, the police received a formal and final confirmation of Fiona's involvement in the incident in the swamp. From that moment on, all investigative efforts no longer focused on finding out who had committed the act, but on the reasons that had led to it. After Fiona's confession, investigators decided to reconstruct the course of events that evening in detail. With the help of the data obtained from forensic technicians and Fiona herself, a clear and complete chronology of the incident at the swamp was created. According to the established facts, the sisters left the house around 6 o'clock in the evening. They walked on their usual route, following a narrow path towards the Deep Sigh swamp. On the swampy ground, experts recorded the footprints of both girls, who stopped a few meters from the shore. There, an argument broke out between them. The reason for the conflict was the medallion that Emily had taken from Fiona and did not want to return. The older sister tried to get it back, which led to a scuffle, which was confirmed by the nature and direction of the tracks in the ground, which clearly showed an abrupt movement and loss of balance of one of the sisters. According to the results of the investigation, Emily then landed in the water. The place of the fall was where a significant depth immediately began, and the shore was too slippery and muddy to free herself independently. At the moment Emily was in the water, the older sister held the medallion in her hand, and it was then that the object was violently pressed against the younger one's neck, leaving the characteristic trace that later became the most important piece of evidence. After the incident, Fiona returned on the same path. About halfway home, she disposed of the piece of jewelry by throwing it into a drainage ditch, which was also confirmed by the location of its discovery by the police. The time from leaving the house to Fiona's return was about 45 minutes, which completely corresponded to the conclusions of the investigation. This precise reconstruction allowed investigators to get a complete picture of the events of that evening and eliminate all discrepancies in the statements previously made by Fiona. Now the investigation faced the task of clarifying the motives that had led to such actions. The trial in the Fiona O'Connor case began in the spring of 2019 and immediately attracted attention, not only because of the circumstances of the crime, but also because of the age of the defendant. All facts had already been confirmed: the confession, the found evidence, the matches of the expert opinions. The question was not guilt, but how to legally assess the act of a person who was only 12 years old. The prosecution argued that Fiona's actions were conscious. She had hidden the object, made false statements, and tried to mislead the investigation, which indicated an understanding of the consequences of her actions. In the opinion of the prosecution, age could not be an excuse. The defense lawyers, on the other hand, insisted on a psychiatric report that spoke of a pronounced emotional disorder and personality disorders. The experts described Fiona as withdrawn, hardly capable of empathy, prone to abrupt mood swings and social isolation. The report pointed out that she acted impulsively at the moment of conflict, under the influence of strong inner tension and pent-up jealousy towards her sister. The court examined all expert opinions and heard the statements of parents, teachers, and specialists. Finally, in April 2019, the verdict was announced. Fiona O'Connor was found guilty. The court decided not to impose standard penalties on her and to commit her to a specialized closed facility for minors until she reached adulthood, where she would be under constant supervision of doctors and psychologists. This decision formally concluded the investigation, but did not answer the question of what had led to the tragedy within the family. When the trial ended and the press gradually turned to other events, a completely new phase of life began for the O'Connor family. Despite the formal conclusion of the case, the consequences of what had happened only began to become truly visible to the survivors. A few months after the verdict, it became known that the parents had decided to divorce. Sarah and Jonathan could no longer be in the same room that constantly reminded them of what had happened. Their shared life was destroyed. The house on the outskirts of the village was put up for sale, and soon the family left Ballymore forever. None of the neighbors and acquaintances ever heard anything from them again. They preferred to disappear completely from public view. Fiona remained in a specialized facility under constant supervision of doctors and psychologists. There was little information about her, but it is known that she was prescribed a long-term therapy program to cope with the diagnosed emotional problems. The events of that evening at the swamp left deep scars not only in the O'Connor family, but throughout the village. Locals tried not to talk about it loudly anymore, but the story constantly reminded them. Some families forbade their children to play near the swamp, and the place got an even worse reputation than before. Officially, the case was closed, but the consequences for each of those involved in this story remained forever. The court and the verdict put a legal end to it, but neither the parents nor Fiona herself could return to a normal life. Their family no longer existed, nor did the possibility of making amends for anything. Ballymore became a quiet place again, but no longer the same as before. In the state of Iowa in September 1971, the mysterious disappearance of young Pam occurred. A few days later, a disturbing discovery was made in the forest. Traces of an incident were found on an old car. The investigators had several suspicious individuals. Among them was a friendly stranger who had offered Pam his help. Her old acquaintance, who was admitted to a psychiatric clinic shortly after the incident, and her husband's former cellmate, with whom a photo of the young woman was found. Cedar Rapids was known as the City of Five Seasons and was considered one of the most peaceful places in the Midwest. Therefore, the news of the incident in the forest shook the residents. From the first days of the investigation, it was clear that finding the culprit would be difficult. However, even a small clue could be decisive in the search for the truth. Around 1840, a call was received at the local police station. The caller reported an unusual find made by young squirrel hunters. The young people noticed something unusual among the trees while hiking on the forest path. As they approached, they saw a motionless figure on the trunk of a damaged car. The condition of the crime scene indicated that everything had not happened today. Shaken by what they saw, the young people rushed home to get adults. Shortly thereafter, Officer Roland Eakey received a radio message about the disturbing find in the forest. The patrol officer and his partner received a message from dispatch asking them to check River Road, where two passers-by had made a disturbing discovery near an old car. After about 50 meters deep in the forest, they found the location mentioned in the report. The first thing the officers noticed was the condition of the car. It had obviously been standing there for a very long time, with weeds grown up to the roof. Despite the precise description from the eyewitnesses, the law enforcement officers were affected by the sight. Roland carefully examined the area around the car and along the road, but could not find any traces of people or vehicles. He then called for backup. The arriving investigators immediately determined that an incident had occurred. While examining the car, they found an important clue that the young woman had not come into the forest voluntarily. The absence of shoes and her clean feet indicated that someone had carried her there. The experts determined that the incident had occurred at least 5 days prior. The condition of her clothing, unnaturally placed sweater and shirt, ill-fitting jeans, indicated the nature of what had happened. On her right hand, she wore a friendship ring. On her left, a wedding and an engagement ring. Despite the external circumstances, the person found was in a preserved state. No documents or clues as to what exactly had happened were found nearby. However, experienced professionals suspected that the choice of such a remote location indicated a planned incident. The discovery was made in a secluded spot outside Cedar Rapids on Gravina Road. It became clear that someone had intentionally chosen this hidden place to cover their tracks. 1 kilometer away was the municipal landfill, which is why traffic on the road was rare. While the experts examined the crime scene for clues, the main questions remained unanswered: the identity of the young woman and the reasons for what had happened. The investigators in Cedar Rapids awaited the experts' conclusions. The medical examination revealed a brain injury from a severe blow to the head. The specialists suspected that the young woman lost consciousness after the first blow, and the lack of immediate help led to irreparable consequences. According to the doctor, the perpetrator may not have planned such an outcome. After realizing what had happened, the perpetrator attempted to cover their tracks. According to the expert report, the incident occurred about 1 week before the discovery. This confirmed the initial suspicions of the investigators working at the crime scene. The evidence found at the crime scene indicated serious circumstances of the incident. However, for the investigation, identifying the victim became the priority. The investigators carefully examined recent missing persons reports. The case of the disappearance of a young woman named Maren Farley caught their attention. Special features, including a tattoo on her arm, helped to establish a connection to the incident in the forest. The time frame of the disappearance matched the experts' opinions. The manager of the local diner where Maren worked was the first to raise the alarm. She became concerned when the employee did not show up for the third consecutive shift. The general manager emphasized Maren's exceptional reliability. She was never late and always called in if she couldn't come. Concerned by the long silence, the manager went to the dormitory. In Maren's room, everything looked normal, except for one detail. Her work uniform was missing from the closet. Maren worked as a waitress at Aid's Cafe. Colleagues described her as a responsible employee. According to investigation data, she was last seen on Friday, September 17th, in the morning after the night shift. On September 20th, the manager filed a missing person report with the police. From Maren's acquaintances, investigators learned that she had recently moved from Sioux City. The reason for the move attracted particular attention from the authorities. It turned out that Maren had married very early. Shortly after the wedding, David, Maren's husband, was admitted to a correctional facility near Cedar Rapids. Maren settled nearby. She rented a room in the dormitory and found a job as a waitress to be closer to her husband. She usually visited her husband almost every week, but that weekend she broke her routine. A meeting followed by church was planned for Sunday, but Maren did not show up and was no longer reachable. Since then, no one has seen her. According to the investigation, something happened between her morning departure for work on Friday and the evening of the same day. In the course of the investigation, officers from Cedar Rapids drove to Sioux City to speak with Maren's mother, Mary. This step proved to be important for the case. The woman felt that something was wrong. She was convinced that her daughter would not simply disappear without reason. After 4 days, the same officers delivered the sad news to Mary. It was a heavy blow for her. She had suspected misfortune, but the news of what had happened left her speechless. It was especially difficult for relatives to remember what Maren was like. She was considered the pride of the Brubaker family and was the oldest of 7 children. Everyone remembered her as intelligent, cheerful, and responsible. Maren was born on July 4th, which, according to her mother, influenced her character. She was bright like fireworks and always ahead of her time. She wanted to grow up quickly. Maren loved all her siblings dearly, but she had an especially close relationship with her younger sister, Lisa. They were inseparable. Wherever Maren went, Lisa followed. This care for her younger sister made Maren mature early. At a young age, she met David Farley, and a strong affection ignited between them. Still very young, they decided to marry. It was a true, passionate love. David came from a wealthy family and Maren was overjoyed with him. But their dreams of a long, happy life were shattered when David was caught in check fraud. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Maren's decision to move to Cedar Rapids because of him led to tragic events. The investigators had little evidence collected at the crime scene. Even the samples obtained had no particular value until the introduction of DNA analysis. The investigators understood that the key to solving the case lay in the search work. They had to retrace Maren's path up to the moment she met the perpetrator. First, they thoroughly examined her room. During the search of personal belongings, law enforcement officers examined Maren's diary and correspondence but found nothing remarkable. The entries showed that she was a dreamy young woman trying to cope with life's difficulties. Only her work clothes were missing from her room. In the course of the investigation, officers questioned the residents of the house about the events of the day. The neighbors' statements provided the first important clue. The superintendent reported hearing a conversation in Maren's room. She noted that the conversation was conducted in a calm tone and did not arouse suspicion. The only thing that caught her attention was that one of the interlocutors spoke in a deep voice. The superintendent also mentioned another interesting detail. A distinct tobacco aroma with an unusually sweet note was perceptible in the room. Although she did not see the visitor herself, she remembered the exact time, afternoon on September 17th. It was on this very day that contact with Marin ceased. The investigators tried to find witnesses who might have seen her after the conversation with the unknown guest. But the search was unsuccessful. No one had seen or spoken to the young woman again. Marin's relatives were at a loss. They could not imagine who the mysterious smoker could be or who would wish her harm. According to them, Marin was well liked by everyone, had no enemies, and never complained about conflicts. She got along easily with people. The relatives had no idea who could be behind her disappearance. The investigation received new impetus from information from Marin's colleague. She reported that her friend had spoken of plans for Friday evening. She wanted to meet an old acquaintance from Sioux City who had promised to invite her somewhere without giving details. This acquaintance was Bobby Moore, who immediately attracted the attention of the investigators. A check revealed his difficult past with several arrests. Law enforcement decided to follow this lead more closely. Marin's husband David asked her to stay away from Moore. He was aware of several instances where Bobby had shown aggression towards women. He warned his wife to be careful with this man. In the course of the investigation, new details came to light. An acquaintance of Marin reported that she had met Bobby Moore in Cedar Rapids shortly after her disappearance. He explained his presence by expressing a desire to help search for his friend. When investigators tried to speak with Moore, they encountered a disturbing circumstance. On the day Marin was discovered, he had admitted himself to a psychiatric clinic in Sioux City. The investigators suspected that this might be related to remorse. The investigators suspected that this was precisely what led him to seek medical help. They suspected him of involvement in the incident. However, if Moore had hoped that hospitalization would protect him from the investigation, he had miscalculated. When he learned of the incident with Marin, he categorically denied any involvement. According to his words, he considered her like a sister and had nothing to do with her disappearance. He claimed to have been in Sioux City at the time. Moore was offered a polygraph test. To the police's surprise, the test results were in his favor. The investigators could not find any clear evidence of his involvement in the incident. Nevertheless, he could not be completely removed from the list of suspects, and soon another person caught the attention of the investigators. In the course of the investigation, detectives continued to gather information about everyone who had contact with Marin in Cedar Rapids in the past 3 weeks. The person Gary Castles attracted particular attention. This man did not accidentally come into the police's sights. He shared a cell with David Farley. The acquaintance with Marin arose during her visits to her husband. Gary was released shortly before Marin's disappearance, when David was still in custody. During Castle's interrogation, investigators examined his personal belongings and made a disturbing discovery. A photograph of Marin Farley was found in his wallet. This raised many questions for the investigators. They were particularly interested in why he kept her photo and what relationship existed between them. The suspicion arose that he had developed a special interest in her during her prison visits, and this lead had to be checked. The investigators reconstructed all of Gary's movements from his release until the evening of Marin's disappearance. There were suspicions that he showed particular interest in her and began to observe her. In the interrogation room, the investigators tried to pressure Gary Cassell. To questions about the incident with Marin, he answered in the negative. Gary stated that on September 18th he was far from Cedar Rapids and could prove it. He actually managed to provide evidence of his whereabouts elsewhere on that day. Later, officers re-examined Marin's room to find traces of Gary's presence on that morning when the administrator had heard a male voice. However, no connection could be established between Gary and the incident. Not a single fact was found that indicated his involvement. Although Castle could not explain the presence of Marin's photo in his wallet, This promising lead did not help advance the investigation. Thereupon, the investigators returned to the diner where Marin had worked and re-interviewed her colleagues and customers. This time, their efforts yielded a result. They obtained important information. One of the regulars named George reported that he had seen Marin on the day of her disappearance with an unknown man who looked like a hippie. The investigators asked the young woman's relatives if they knew anyone matching this description. Marin's husband David immediately drew the police's attention to George as a suspicious person. When law enforcement investigated George's past, they understood David Farley's concerns. It turned out that George had offered Marin the help of his acquaintances in releasing her husband. The question remained: was it a sincere desire to help, or a way to get closer to the young woman? Knowing her difficulties, he offered to repair her car. However, the investigators doubted the selflessness of this offer, especially given the significant age difference between them. George explained to the police that during a night conversation with the young waitress, he decided to offer a helping hand. According to him, the problems of the young woman, who was in a difficult life situation, touched him. The investigators doubted his story and inquired about his whereabouts at the time of Marin's disappearance. He stated that he had been at work. The check confirmed. He was indeed at the Cedar Rapids bus depot from 1300 to 2100. The analysis of the time frame showed that George's work schedule did not allow him to be involved in the incident. The investigators had to look for other leads, but after thoroughly reviewing all possible clues, they hit a dead end. By 1972, the investigation had reached an impasse. Law enforcement officers checked all possible involved parties, but everyone had a confirmed alibi. For Marin's relatives, the lack of progress became a new ordeal in a series of emotional strains. It was difficult for the family to find the strength to cope with these circumstances. What happened to Marin particularly affected her mother. Alone with 6 children, she found the strength every morning to get up and take care of them. The event deeply shook the entire family. Presumably, these experiences influenced Lisa's life path, Marin's sister, who decided to work in law enforcement. For many years, she used her position to remind her colleagues in Cedar Rapids how the unsolved case had affected their family. A deep sorrow remained in the souls of the relatives. They sought answers to the questions: who did it, and why Marin of all people? For over 30 years, the Marin Farley case remained in the archives of the Cedar Rapids Police Department. In 2006, a new investigator took over the case and discovered unexamined evidence. He sent the found samples to the laboratory for modern analysis. The results obtained opened new perspectives in the investigation. After the latest laboratory analyses, experts managed to create a genetic profile of the presumed perpetrator. The investigators hoped that the new findings and advanced investigation methods would lead them to solve the mystery of Marin's disappearance. However, comparing the obtained profile with the database yielded no matches. This led to a new delay in the investigation of a full 9 years. In 2015, investigator Matt Denlinger, after carefully reviewing all documents, created a list of 75 names of individuals who had been mentioned in the initial phase of the investigation. He was determined to obtain genetic samples from each of them. This task proved not to be easy and time-consuming. The investigator had to locate all individuals on the list, take their biological samples, and wait for the expert opinions. Checking so many people could take years. To speed up the process, he enlisted retired Lieutenant Ken Oshburn and former investigator J.D. Smith. The team decided to start with the first names on Denlinger's extensive list, focusing particularly on 2 individuals who had piqued the investigators' interest in the 70s. They managed to find Bobby Moore and take the necessary sample. After review, he was excluded as a suspect. When the analysis of Harry Castles also yielded no matches, the investigation once again reached an impasse. In the year 2018, a new investigative method emerged: forensic genealogy. This method helped solve several high-profile cases in California, The teacher from Cedar Rapids hoped that this approach would also help in her situation. The investigators were convinced of the success of the new method. However, after the evidence was sent to the lab, it turned out that the material was too damaged for analysis. Despite the disappointment, the team did not give up and continued the search by other means. Upon resuming the investigation, they focused on a person who had raised questions with the previous team, George Smith, a frequent guest at the local diner. Upon reviewing his past, they noticed that genetic material had never been taken from him for comparison. While examining George Smith's biography, investigators learned that he had passed away in the year 2013 at the age of 94. In a memorial article, friends spoke warmly of the popular Cedar Rapids businessman. Particularly memorable was the mention of the characteristic aroma of sweet tobacco that always surrounded George. These words, and the photo of the elder Smith, caught the attention of investigator J.D. Smith. He recalled an important detail. The dormitory caretaker had mentioned the sweet smell of cigars near Marin's room on the day of her disappearance. At that moment, the investigator realized this exact man had been there on that day. It turned out that George Smith was not truthful when he spoke of his shift at the bus depot that Friday. This circumstance prompted investigators to take a closer look at him. His overly friendly demeanor, in particular, made them suspicious. Police officers in the 1970s had already regarded him with suspicion back then. Now the team had to thoroughly investigate all aspects of George Smith's life in the year 1971 to understand his possible involvement in the incident. It turned out that Smith had separated from his wife shortly before the incident. At that time, he lived very close to the dormitory where Marin resided. This meant he could easily know her whereabouts. Notably, Smith worked in waste management. Through this job, he was well acquainted with the route to the landfill where Marin was later found. The investigators planned an additional examination to obtain a DNA sample. However, the funeral home delivered unpleasant news. There was no longer any possibility to take a sample. The investigation stalled once again. Then Denlinger developed another approach. He decided to obtain a DNA sample from one of Smith's children. Matt found his daughter, who agreed to help with the investigation. The sample was sent for analysis. On the 24th of September, 2021, exactly 50 years after that fateful day, the investigation results arrived. They confirmed George Smith's involvement in Marin's disappearance. The date of the results did not seem coincidental to the investigators. Half a century had passed. The investigators struggled to process what had happened, as did Marin's relatives when they received the news they had waited 50 long years for. Investigator Matt Denlinger remembers every second of the conversation with Marin's sister. Lisa's emotional reaction is forever etched in his memory. But most surprising were her words. "My mother is here. Tell her." Matt was stunned. He had not expected Marin's mother to still be alive. It was precisely such moments that had once brought him and his colleagues into law enforcement. He was given the honor of informing the elderly lady that her daughter's case was finally solved, albeit after so long. Marin's family found no words of thanks for the investigators who had not given up and had seen the case through to the end. This moment was special. A triumph of justice. A victory of light over darkness. The exact events of that day, when Marin Farley's and George Smith's paths crossed, remained unknown. But the collected evidence helped investigators reconstruct the possible sequence of events. They suspect that George probably invited Marin over under the pretext of help, possibly for legal advice or a car repair. When Marin arrived, George apparently tried to gain her attention. After she rejected his advances, the situation took a tragic turn. The situation spiraled out of control. An incident occurred after which Marin was in a helpless state. Smith presumably had not planned such an outcome, but his actions led to irreparable consequences. According to investigators, he remained in his house until nightfall. When darkness fell, Smith drove to a secluded wooded area. Investigators assumed that George drove his car there. In the woods, he went to a ravine where an abandoned old car was located. After leaving traces of his presence on the trunk of the abandoned car, he disappeared from the crime scene. Although Marin's relatives were grateful for the answers received, the conclusion of the investigation stirred up old feelings they had tried to forget for years. Unfortunately, not all relatives lived to see this moment. Marin's two brothers and her father never learned the full truth of what happened. Investigators hope that solving this cold case carries an important message. Families of victims must not give up hope, and perpetrators should remember, the law does not forget.